One of the realities about life when we talk about things like graduation and we talk about camp and we talk about parking lot, there are just some things in life that are very constant. They're just very constant. And I don't know about you, but I get reminded of that this time of year when you've got another wave of graduations and another wave of open houses. For me, it's often sobering because I feel like I just graduated a couple years ago. And then I start to think about how many open houses I've been to in the last X number of years. And I did not just graduate. And then somebody will have the audacity to show me a picture of what I was wearing when I graduated, and I think, clearly I did not just graduate, because who let me wear that, right? I mean, and so we all, but it's like they just keep coming, right? And open houses just keep coming, and graduations just keep coming, and parking lots keep getting holes in them, and road construction in the summer in Michigan keeps coming, right? I mean, there are some constants that happen. And some of them are great, and some of them, honestly, are very neutral. We almost don't notice them. We almost maybe even take them for granted a little bit. I mean, gravity's fairly constant, and most of us haven't thought about it in a while, and most of us right now, though, are kind of glad for it in this moment, now that we've pointed it out, right? I'm really glad that the sun keeps coming up. I'm really grateful that the seasons changed. I wish they didn't change quite so often, but I'm glad we get summer. It keeps coming back around. There are some things that are just constant. There are things that are constant about life. There are things that are constant about you. There are things that are constant about us. There are things that are just constant about Jesus. And over the next few weeks, I want to invite us to look at a very small passage of the Scripture in which we're going to see some things that are constant and how deeply interconnected they actually are. If you have a Bible or you're going to unlock a device or something, I want to invite you to go to Psalm chapter 3. So Psalm is in the middle of the Bible. Psalm chapter 3, there's 150 Psalms. So if you find Psalms, you're going to go to kind of the beginning of it. And the Psalms are written really as expressions of the heart. A lot of them are poetry. We sing a lot of songs that are influenced by the Psalms, which many were written to originally be songs. And so they shape a lot of even what we think. They shape a lot about how we see honest, candid relationship between God and humanity. Many of them were written by a guy named David, who was he was a son, he was a brother, overlooked by his dad, and kind of knocked around a little bit by his brothers verbally and overlooked by them some. He actually became he was a shepherd. He was really good at that, tending sheep and protecting them. He actually became a really good soldier. He actually became like a hero in his nation for defeating a big giant army, David and Goliath, and you've probably heard that story. He actually becomes king. He actually becomes a husband. He actually becomes a father. Like David has a pretty remarkable life, but in also many ways, like you can think about, he was king and all this, but in so many ways, David's an ordinary human. He's just an ordinary guy, right? And a lot of the Psalms give us a window into his life, including the ups and downs, and Psalm 3 is one of those. And in Psalm 3, here's the thing, it's literally 12 very short sentences or explanations. It's 8 verses, but inside the 8 verses, there's just 12 sentences. And these 12 sentences carry so much weight that can help us, can help people like you and me, and maybe more importantly, can help us together navigate some constant in life and find some of what is constant about God while we navigate what is constant for us. So I want to just begin by reading just a couple of lines from Psalm chapter 3. Again, we're going to hang out on just these 12 sentences for the next couple of weeks. But here's the first couple of lines. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? And many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. God, how many are the people that are now seemingly all against me? God, how many are the people who are plotting to get me? God, now they're even saying not only that they want to kill me, but God, now they're actually saying, I don't have any kind of relationship with you. God won't do anything from me. And this is a guy who had a very candid relationship with God. He wasn't perfect. He sinned. He pushed against God. He ignored God. He went through repentance. This is the guy that a little bit later in your Bible, in the New Testament, people refer back to him as a man after God's own heart. And God describes the beauty of his heart. And yet here he is in this moment, God, everybody's against me. And it's largely in this moment, probably, as best we can tell, probably coming out of a chaotic period of time in David's family. And some things that maybe he didn't handle perfectly, but that now he actually has some of his own children trying to kill him. How many are my foes? How many rise up against me? What we get in these first two verses, these first few sentences, what we get is what is actually very common throughout the book of Psalms. In fact, it's probably true that up to 2/3 of the 150 Psalms contain some element of what's true in these first two verses. And it's just the honesty of a lament, like a lamenting. And a lament, if we were to just break it down and distill it for ourselves today, lament is really just a very passionate expression of grief or sorrow. David's not really expressing sadness, and he's not really just complaining. He's not really just voicing his trouble. He's lamenting. It's this passionate expression of grief and sorrow. It's this passionate expression of having to be on the run. Yet again, this wasn't David's only time on the run. It's this passionate expression of the sorrow that comes from knowing that he has probably disappointed his family, and the grief that comes from knowing now some of his family is out to actually kill him. It's the grief of knowing that people are saying things about him that have never been true. It's the sorrow that comes from knowing that once again, he feels like he's living in isolation. It's this deep and passionate grief and sorrow. And please notice that about this case with David, because this is so helpful for some of us, that this is not about a moment. David is not lamenting a single moment, which we often have to do. But David is lamenting an entire period of time that he's in. When David is lamenting, there's no closure. There's no neat bow at the end yet. David's got as good a chance of surviving as he does being killed. It's this deep grief and sorrow. Jesus did it. At least 3 times we know that Jesus just had moments of lamenting, of this deep grief and sorrow. One was when he got up on a hill and he looked out over Jerusalem. And he wept and he just said, look, man, folks, I came to help you. I came to gather you in. I came to give you a more life-giving way to be with the God who made you. I came to take off some of the burden you have self-imposed on yourself. I came to free you from the trap of the temporary, but you keep rejecting me. And he's literally grieving over their lack of response. He's grieving over the pain they're going to continue to live in. And the sorrow is deep and real. It's Jesus lamenting, like just acknowledging this is hard. Does it again when he's in the garden before his crucifixion, when he please God, let there be some other way. I don't want to do this cross thing. And he grieves it. The lamenting is so deep that he actually sweats drops of blood. He does it another time when his friend Lazarus has died, and Jesus is coming to the town where Lazarus has died, and Lazarus, one of Jesus' best friends. And Jesus shows up, and you got to get this. Jesus shows up, and Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And yet Jesus pauses before he raises us from the dead, and he experiences this lament. It's the shortest verse in all of the Bible, 2 words, Jesus wept. And he doesn't necessarily weep because of what's coming. He weeps, and he's lamenting because the people around him are lamenting. Lazarus, his sister, and family, and friends, they're grieving. They're experiencing deep sorrow. So Jesus joins them in that. Like he steps right into their lamenting, which is so encouraging because that's the practice of Jesus. If we would, when we acknowledge our lamenting, we experience new levels with Jesus because he's always been willing to step into our lamenting. Listen, Jesus will watch your lamenting from as far as you make him. And he will enter your lamenting as far as you will let him. Which means this. Somewhere along the way, friends, it's okay. It's okay, and it's even helpful to be a lot like David and to be a lot like Jesus. And just admit that lamenting in different levels of intensity is an almost constant part of life. So much can be going so well, and there can still be elements of lamenting. And please listen, David's events are traumatic. But not all lamenting is caused by traumatic events. Sometimes we lament because we've worked so hard for something. And then we maybe don't get the acknowledgement or the reward that we thought we deserved or that we would. And we look and we say, maybe, why did I get overlooked? Or why didn't my hard work pay off as well as I thought it would there? And we actually lament. There's this deep grief and this deep sorrow about what didn't happen. We even lament over the changing of time and season in our lives. New seasons cause lamenting. I remember when I finished college, and I formed some of my greatest friendships there, some of my greatest friends ever, still to this day. And I remember how great the celebration was when it was over, and I also remember the grief and the sorrow that it was over. And that geography on some level was going to change all of those relationships, or at least the rhythm of them. I unashamedly admit that every single year my girls have gone to school, I have had deep lament. I've cried every year, including preschool. Their freshman year, which ended up being radically altered by COVID, but their freshman year, when they went and it was all normal, whatever that meant, I still remember it was day 3. I dropped them off on day 3. And I drove to this building and sat in a back room and wept for 20 minutes. As excited as I could be for them. And grieving the end of the part of another season. Sometimes we lament because we've been treated unfairly or we've received unkind wounds. I spent some time with a guy this past week who is processing abuse in his life from a few decades ago. And still lamenting that some. Sometimes we have a living lament, a little bit like David did. There's a relationship that we have that matters greatly to us, and the other person in the relationship is making decisions that are breaking your heart and causing you concern. and maybe are in a bad cycle, and you want so much for them, and you're clinging to hope for them. But look, sometimes the weight of carrying hope for somebody else actually brings lament to your life. This deep grief and deep sorrow for what they're in. Sometimes it is tragic and traumatic. It's instantaneous loss. It's premature death. One of the things that's been true about Journey is because we just planted 15 years ago, we're still a fairly young church, is that we started with largely young people. And in 15 years, if I don't count people from my own family, like my own grandparents, in 15 years, out of all the funerals I've done one of a person in their 80s who lived a long and good life. It's always been premature death. And it stirs the lament of deep grief and deep sorrow because it doesn't make sense and you can't compute it. And it raises new questions and hard questions, and it turns new layers of hurt, and you live with it on some level, like it stays with you for a significant period of time. There's not a great bow wrapped on the end of it. Sometimes the lament is just great uncertainty. It's great tragedy followed by periods of great uncertainty. Even this week in our church, Friday morning, Jeff and Liz Fanko, who are an active part of the Journey family, two of their children, Anna and Timmy, were in a terrible car accident and are still in very serious condition. I mean, it's really critical. And you lament for all of it and for all of them. You have deep grief and sorrow from the tragedy and the pain of it. And you have deep grief and sorrow. Just come with me for a minute. You have deep grief and sorrow when you see parents who suddenly can't be in a room with their kid, who can't get close enough, and you just, it just starts to rip your insides out. It's deep grief. It's deep sorrow. It's passionate grief and sorrow. And I love that David leads the way. And can I just say for a minute, guys, David's a man's man. I don't know what you've been doing, but this dude was killing like lions and bears with slingshots. I don't know what your life has been marked by, but I know some of y'all think you're tough, but I'm just like, yeah. And then he went and killed a giant with a 1-2. Like, I would not want to mess with that guy. And yet here he is, a man of deep anguish, acknowledging, I'm not complaining, I'm not just sad, I'm not just discouraged, I'm not just scared. My heart and my lungs, my very breath is filled with passionate grief and sorrow. And I just want to invite us, church, this morning to acknowledge without shame and without guilt and without embarrassment, and as a great sign of strength, not weakness. A great sign of courage, not fear. I'd love us just to be able to acknowledge our lament. No matter how big or small it seems. Whether it's the breakup of a relationship that never really had any traction, to a missed opportunity in the day and the rain ruining something that all the way to significant loss, all of it can lead to lament. What in you is the new lament? What in you is the old, lasting lament? What's the purpose? Like, what's the get behind a lament? If God can redeem anything, which he can, then what's the purpose behind a lament? There's a guy named N.T. Wright. He's essentially a globally renowned, respected biblical scholar, but remarkably practical, has written books that people like you and me, like we can actually understand them and digest them. And he's got several things he says about a lament that I think are so helpful. And I just want to give you a few of them. Maybe you just jot these down because I know it can feel like a little bit overwhelming when we get into a message or into a passage like this. But the first reality is that a lament is actually a form of praise. The lament it's actually a form of our praise. It is part of how we are saying, God, you have all of me. It is part of how we're saying, God, I am desperate. I'm not even sure what I'm desperate for you to do, but I'm desperate for you to do something. God, I'm at a point where I don't have a vocabulary. In fact, God, my prayers in this time of lamenting might all be groaning. It might all be groaning. It might all be tears. It might all be questions like David's were so many times in the Psalms. God, why aren't you doing something? When will you do something? How long is this going to last? Where are you? How can I see you again? How long are you going to delay? I mean, maybe your lament it raises all the questions. And that's okay. Relationships are marked by questions and honesty. The lament. It's proof of this form of praise. And then it's also proof of relationship. See, relationships, the best relationships include everything. The celebration, the boredom, and the grief and sorrow. The best relationships are not marked only by celebration. And please hear me, they're not marked only by lamenting. I know some relationships, they are marked only by lamenting. And they're remarkably dysfunctional, and unfortunately, they lead to newly created lamenting unnecessarily oftentimes. Relationships are marked by the fullness, the celebration, the boredom, and the lamenting. And when we lament with God, when we are like David and we are honest and we let the lament out, when we are like Jesus, who to his own heavenly Father is lamenting, it's really just a proof and an expression of the relationship. And the beauty of that is what builds inside of that is that the lament then becomes a pathway to intimacy. It becomes a pathway in which the relationship can actually grow, which the relationship can actually expand. It gets us moving in a painful but good direction. That's true for our relationship with God. It's true for our human relationships as well. When the morning that Erica and I found out that my dad had taken his own life, we were in a hotel in Columbus, Ohio, on our way back from Virginia, and we stopped in Columbus because we liked it. We'd hang out there, and we were on our way back to Battle Creek, which is where our families lived at the time. And that morning, when my mom called and shared that with us, I'm not sure I grabbed a hold of the pathway to intimacy that was available. Because instead of talking about it to Erica, instead of lamenting with her, I left the hotel for 2 hours and didn't tell her where I was going. And that was before Find My was available on phones. I did come back with donuts 2 hours later, if that helps any of you. From Tim Hortons, nonetheless. But what had really opened was this pathway to intimacy. When you go down Payne's Road with somebody, if you'll stay on the road together, the relationship's going to grow. The connection's going to deepen. In fact, just as a bonus thought, most of our relationships most of our relationships lack great depth and great connection because we're still really good at avoiding pain. Which is why I'm so glad that people like David and people like Jesus modeled lament for us. This is killing me. My grief and my sorrow is so deep that I don't even know what I need from God, and I don't know what I need from other people. But I'm just going to voice it, and then I'm going to take what comes my way. I'm just going to receive. I'm going to be a good receiver of God's presence and his compassion and how he does that through other people. And then the fourth thing, again, it just keeps building here. It's a little bit of a building block that's happening for us, is it helps and facilitates our participation in the pain of others. Compassion comes easiest when you're familiar with somebody else's pain. Compassion comes easiest when you're familiar with somebody else's pain. We can choose compassion for anybody, right? But it's easiest to be compassionate when you have suffered what other people are suffering. It just is true. It doesn't mean when we've suffered it, it doesn't mean our advice is any better. It doesn't mean that people need all of our advice, honestly. But there's something when we've actually suffered that, we know that. We know that there aren't easy answers. We know the cliches don't really matter. What we know, because we've experienced it, is that it's really presence that matters. It's just easier. This is no points to us, no credit to us. It's just a little easier for Eric and I to have compassion with couples who are navigating infertility. It just is. It's just a little easier, especially for Erica, to navigate compassion for people who have a parent with a debilitating disease. It's just part of our story. You have a story. You've had lamenting. And if you let yourself experience the lamenting, the compassion in that area becomes easier for you to express to somebody else. It's God redeeming it. It's God pulling it back. It's God grabbing a hold of it again and saying, okay, look, this is awful, but let me redeem it. Let me pull it back. Let me bring good out of it. Let me infuse my grace and my peace into that. So here's what we're going to do. Is we're going to give ourselves some time to acknowledge whatever our current lament is. Please hear me on this. No matter how small or how big it seems to you. Please understand that what you might think of the magnitude of the lament is irrelevant right now. The only thing that matters is the freedom to lament and the permission you give yourself to lament. Could I just say to you that regardless of what you label the magnitude of your lament, Jesus is already lamenting for you and would love to lament with you. Let me just say that again for you, okay? Jesus is already lamenting for you, and he would love to lament with you. He's already lamenting for things in our church collectively, like the Finkos and other people experiencing great trauma and great loss and great disappointment and lamenting things in their marriages and everything else. He would like to do that with us. And so our team is going to come back, and they're just going to create a little space for us. Okay, that's all they're just going to create a little space for us. And we're just going to sing this song that I think is a little bit of the prayer of the lament that if we could just get a touch, like a reminder of your presence, if we could push through fear and be unafraid and opening ourselves up to you in the lament, if we could push through the cultural norm of denying the pain or hiding the pain or giving answers like I'm fine or it'll be okay or I'm fine, they're not, if we could just allow ourselves to become receivers this morning, lamenters and receivers, lamenters and receivers. And here's the thing, just if you want to think about it, 3 almost categories. Number 1, what are you lamenting for yourself? What are you lamenting for yourself? What loss, what trauma? memory, what thing? What are you lamenting for yourself? What are you lamenting for others? Again, some of you are carrying the weight of the ongoing lament for somebody else, and you're engaged in the relationship, and you love them. You love them. But you carry this deep grief and sorrow over what they find themselves in, and maybe what they keep putting themselves in, or the cycle they are in, or the addiction they carry, or the disappointment. And your lament is for them. Or maybe just what's your lament for the world? It feels easy to find something to lament in the world right now, doesn't it? You don't even have to try very hard for that one. But if I could just be honest with you, the causes for lament are coming so constantly in our world, and they're so constantly thrown in front of us, that sometimes for me, the easier option is just to let that numbness settle in. Not sure it's fully the healthy or Jesus-shaped thing to do. I'm not even sure it's the Jesus-empowered thing to do. So what are you just lamenting for the world? I want to invite you to stand. If you're joining from home today or a vacation spot, whatever position seems most comfortable for you. And I've invited you to stand, but now let me give you all sorts of permission. We're going to pray this song. And while we do, maybe you need to move a little. Maybe you need to be able to walk somewhere in this room. Maybe you need to kneel at a seat or even here at the front. Maybe you need to sit back down. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that we would say yes to Jesus' invitation. To be people who lament, and in our lament be people who receive. This is part of the pathway to healing, friends. But you might notice 2 verses into this thing, there's no ribbon on it. I'm not even going to attempt to put a ribbon on this for us today. We're just going to live where David's living for a minute. Let's just take this time with the Lord.